Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for sticking around. I'm Aleah Kiley. I'm a graduate student in the Film and Media Studies department, and I'm so fortunate to have Professor Elana Levine with me from the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee to talk about those three shows we just watched, A Father Knows Best, Mary Tyler Moore, and Modern Family. So to structure the conversation a little bit, I think we'll start with talking about the role of television in culture and society more generally. Okay. And then we'll dive into the episodes and talk about the themes of gender, work, and family as we go.
Great.
Sound good to everyone? All right. So can you talk a little bit about why TV, especially commercial TV, this kind of TV, is important for us to look at and somehow can allow us to have cultural conversations? Seems
sure.
Maybe like a old show from the 50s or a show from the 70s or a formulaic sitcom might not be able to reveal much about gender or family. Can you talk a little bit about why that's important?
Sure. Well, thank you so much, Aleah and Patrice and everybody. It's a thrill to be here and to be able to talk about all of this today. I think that it's easy to dismiss television that we see as commercial, as fluffy, as entertaining, as silly, as all of this stuff certainly is. But really, television has long served as a really central storytelling form in American society and, of course, much of the rest of the world as well. And for much of television history, there were relatively few options for what was available to watch. And so the fact that so many people would have been watching Father Knows Best or Mary Tyler Moore, and we can talk about how that might be a little bit different in some ways with a more contemporary example like Modern Family, you really can start to think about the stories that are being told there as a space where the culture is thinking about and contemplating issues that are central to it. Because it's a commercial medium, its goal is to sell advertising slots, right? But it also wants to appeal to people. It wants people to want to watch, to tune in, to be invested, to keep coming back to see those advertising messages. And of course, the creators have goals beyond just those advertising messages. They have stories that they want to tell. And those things coming together can make for some really intriguing insights into the culture in which we live.
Yeah, I think almost, it sounds like especially at the time period that we were talking about, kind of the 50s and the 70s, is so different from the fragmented, too much TV content. There's so much we can watch. There's so many ways to watch. People are watching in different rooms. Can you talk a little bit about how the context, you touched on it a little bit, but how that context was different, maybe for the Mary Tyler Moore and for Father Knows Best, and then how maybe we consider those shows differently? How were they able to maybe inform a different kind of cultural conversation than maybe not everyone watches Modern Family in this room, which would be a very different kind of viewing context?
Right. Well, the period of television history up till about the mid to late 80s is sometimes called the network era because the three main broadcast networks, ABC, NBC, and CBS, were pretty much the only game in town. PBS comes along in the late 60s. But you had those, relatively few number of options for what people could have been watching. And vast, numbers of people were watching those shows at any one time. And so just the kind of cultural centrality of television programming in that era is allowed it to be a kind of common conversation that has become more tricky especially in the 2010s as we've had, more and more fragmentation of audiences in the streaming era. But this has been going on for a few decades now from the rise of cable on. And the contemporary context, it's very hard sometimes to find common conversations. And yet you have a show like Modern Family, which is on ABC, one of the broadcast networks that's still around, of course, and that is still getting, a larger audience than most things on television. Right. And it's still trying to speak to a kind of common cultural currency in a way that's not that different from what those earlier programs were doing that were also, of course, on broadcast networks. And so I think there are some continuities there in terms of the way that they're trying to speak to a broad audience in terms that many different people might find some way to connect to. At the same time, however, there's literally less people watching any one thing, even something that appears on a network like ABC.
And so you touched on this a little bit already, but I think it's interesting. A lot of times media or television or films are sometimes thought of as a mirror. It's reflecting back to us what we are, but it doesn't really quite seem to capture what television is or what the media is. It's at once capturing and maybe reflecting, but it's also representing it in a certain way. It's kind of pushing certain things forward and leaving some things off of the agenda. So can you talk a little bit about kind of what is television's relationship to social change, to kind of that cultural conversation?
Sure. I like the metaphor of a distorted mirror to think about television's relationship to our society, in that it's not that it's has nothing to do with the society. It is showing us something about our world, but it's not showing us an exact duplication of the world, of course. It's showing a kind of, funhouse mirror, distorted mirror view, where it's capturing certain things that are like the world, but kind of shaping them in particular ways, and of course not showing certain things, leaving some things out of the picture. And so I think that that's a useful way of thinking about it, because you have to kind of walk that fine line between it has something to do with our world, but it's not an exact duplication of it. And that's personally one of the things I think is so interesting about it, is because then you can really delve in and think about, well, in what ways is it speaking to our world? And sometimes it's opening a very small, tiny little crack of a window of something that might be new or different, or a kind of rising sentiment in the culture. And, over time, that window could kind of crack open more and more and more. And you can kind of see that when you look at television, especially across different time periods, and you see shifts that happen. Of course, you also see other things that don't change so much, and that's also interesting to know.
Which we saw a lot of this evening. I think, well, maybe we could talk a little bit about why these shows. So there was a lot we could have chosen. Sure. There's a lot to choose from, obviously. What do you think, why these shows, I guess? What's instructive about these shows? We can maybe talk about genre in a second, or if you want to talk about that now, but there's so much different types of programming that has, started in the 50s and the 60s that is still resonant today. What does the sitcom or the family sitcom have to tell us, and why these particular shows do you think are important?
Yeah, well, sitcoms have been a central part of television storytelling, and really radio storytelling before television, all throughout their history, as you say. And comedy, of course, has a very long history culturally. Everybody likes funny things. And so that's, it makes it a kind of quintessential form of television in a way that is useful if you're trying to think across time again, and to look at how things change. And throughout all of television history, this notion of a family sitcom has been really prominent, in that sometimes it's a very conventional family, like the Father Knows Best case of the conventional nuclear family of the Andersons. And sometimes, at certain points in TV history, and particularly in the 70s when Mary Tyler Moore comes about, you start to have what was sometimes called the workplace family, where you start to get a kind of glimpse of it in this, because of course this is the first episode, but you start to get a glimpse of how Mary's going to kind of have a family of sorts, both in the apartment building and then in the workplace, where you just are starting to get to know her coworkers. And so in a lot of ways, even though this was quite different, and that the setting was a single woman's apartment and her workplace as opposed to a conventional nuclear family, you start to see some of the same patterns. And then, of course, Modern Family is very deliberately called Modern Family, because it's repeating so many of those family sitcom formulas, but it's trying to give this clever twist. And I don't know if you remember the first episode of Modern Family, when there's like the reveal of how all of these characters are actually connected to each other. Yeah, so you kind of meet the three different families, and then you learn that they're all related to each other and what the relationship is. And it was, the big twist that was about sort of, we're going to tell you a family story in a new way. And so that notion of the family, and this of course connects to the fact that television is understood to be something, at least for most of its history, that people experience in their homes, where they watch with their families, in a living room or family room or rec room, as sometimes it was called historically, and that being a way to connect with the family by actually telling stories about families. Of course, one more thing about it is that the family, of course, is multi-generational, and for much of TV history, the idea was like, let's try and pull in everybody to watch our programming, and so something that can appeal to the kids and the parents and the grandparents sounded really great to the creators of television.
And probably the sitcom then, as you touched on, wants to kind of be able to engage that broader cultural conversation. So these shows that are going to be on networks that are looking for broader audiences, they're not trying to build cult fan audiences or anything, are probably going to continue to use this kind of format in order to continually draw in those kinds of broader audiences.
Exactly. So, a show like Modern Family on ABC is still trying to reach a broader audience than, say, a niche streaming platform might be, or a cable channel that has a particular audience in mind. And so those tendencies are going to make something like the family sitcom a good fit. Because it's imagined to appeal to a wide range of viewers.
So I'd like to jump into the episodes now. Betty Girl Engineer, so Father Knows Best. I want to start with the end because you just have to start with the end. Watching it now, it's just such a betrayal of this emerging young woman's consciousness, and it just seems like it's almost violent. You just feel like, oh, it's so hard to watch, and it's so sudden. She's so certain, and then suddenly it just happens.
Yeah.
So can you talk about the end and maybe what work it's doing and how it fits with the rest of the episode and how it's kind of positioned there?
I think one of the things that's so interesting watching it in the contemporary context is how you can see how there was that commercial break when it seems that Betty is not going to even speak to Doyle, and then it comes back. You can see it fades out and it comes back. So that would have been when the commercial was placed originally. And it's quite a brief, like what is sometimes called a tag at the end of the episode, where everything gets kind of tied up neatly, and it turns out she really does, just want to go on a date with him and doesn't really care about being an engineer after all. And it's crushing in some ways from our contemporary perspective, but my guess is that, it might have been kind of crushing at the time too for a lot of audiences. Because Betty is she's kind of so inspiring in that episode, and she's so, spunky in the Lou Grant's terms for Mary. Betty kind of has that quality too. And she, she's really persuasive throughout the episode. And so it seems like, my guess is, so I don't know, and I'm not sure that we have any evidence of this, that there was, I don't think somebody came and said, you have to make sure she was on the dress at the end. Nobody was telling anybody that they had to do that. But we're talking about 1956. We're talking about a time when the culture was quite conservative in terms of its gender roles. And although at the same time there's starting to be changes, there's starting to be ways in which more equality between men and women is becoming a bigger, more prominent cultural and social issue. And you can really just see that bubbling out in this episode, both how there's a potential for change and how the culture's not quite ready to go that far. And so kind of puts that very conventional conclusion on it and brings Betty back into this very traditional role. But I'm not sure that it really erases what happens before that in the episode, because most of what I think it's hard to not remember that ending, but if you've watched this episode, you remember all of the sort of funny things that happen along the way, and Betty's kind of persistence and enthusiasm, I think, is really what stands out for me.
Yeah, she's so reasonable. I think that's the hard thing about kind of the harassment and the discounting, is that she's just so practical and reasonable about it, and she's thought through it. She's not being, she's not being she's not being rash. She's just so level-headed, and I think that's what makes it difficult. I want to talk about the dress and clothes in general. So clothes are very symbolic in this episode. She's obviously, her mom's pushing the dress on her. She has to wear the work shirt and the boots, and the hat doesn't quite fit right, and of course the dress in the end. Can you talk about what clothes are doing? Why clothes? Why do you think that is so important to this? Yeah,
it's such a great, symbol of the tension in the episode. And so, it's we might not think about Father Knows Best as like the height of, elegant writing, but it's actually a really kind of elegant plot device to have this theme that goes throughout the episode where there's this, the role of the clothing. Because I think clothing was such an important, and still is, such an important marker of gender identity. And it's one of the key ways in which Betty's disruption of what's expected of her is made visible. In that there's this dress that everyone assumes she's going to love, and she's totally disinterested in it.
Yes.
And then the way she's like literally taking her brother's clothing, and and all of those, there's other markers of gender too, right? Like the name, the whole BJ thing, but the clothing is one of the primary markers. And I think, part of it surely is 50s American culture and expectations for what was appropriate for young women to wear. One of my favorite gags in that is the whole joke about his, his mother and his sister and his aunt and their skirts running back home from the voting booth, and how Betty makes fun of that. She's so clever in the way she does that, but that fact that their dress is important there, and is also an image that really sticks in my mind. And so I think it's just really highlighting those kind of somewhat surface examples of gender, and by kind of making jokes out of it, I think it's poking a little bit at how surface it is and how ultimately insignificant those things are, even though obviously in the end she puts on the dress and she kind of readapts to those conventional markers of gender.
And I think it's interesting that she, it's almost like, of course, we change the clothes we put on to go out into public as we do at home, but there is a sense of, she's having to suit up to go into this different kind of environment that really isn't for her.
Right.
And it highlights that by she really signaling that for us with the clothes change.
For sure, and also how different she is, I think, from her mother in particular. Like Margaret is really the opposition here is I think mainly Margaret. Margaret's the most distraught by this whole thing.
Yeah, she
and
is.
She also looks the most, she's always in her proper, housewife dress.
You're right. She's seems so responsible for reproducing kind of this family environment and these roles. Well, that gets me to, I love watching this. I love how high the stakes are for her to be exploring this, to be going on these little vocational lessons. It's like, she doesn't know if she should put out his or hers towels. She doesn't know if she has a boy or a girl anymore. She doesn't know. She hates BJ. She doesn't, and then Doyle's whole rant about how bridges aren't going to be made anymore. And basically society's going to crumble if she goes and has any kind of vocational experience.
Right.
So can you talk about just how extreme?
Yeah.
I mean, just their responses are so extreme.
Right, and I think this is partly where the comedy element comes in, right? So, one thing that makes things funny is when they're excessive, and so I think we're supposed to sort of knowingly kind of nod along with Betty's parents, but at the same time, we're supposed to chuckle at them as well. Like, you're kind of, everybody, the laughs are a different level of laughs than in like the Modern Family style comedy, but everybody, you're kind of chuckling lightly at everybody. And I think you chuckle at them as well as at Betty. And so that's, I think that's important, that their excessive reaction, and maybe Margaret's in particular, are also part of the humor here. So we're not just supposed to like assume she's 100%, right. But I think one of the things that really comes out in the episode is the generational differences, and how there's a real difference between Betty and her siblings even, and the parents. So the siblings kind of rib her, but they're not really worked up about the gender stuff.
Right.
Right. Bud calls her BJ, in kind of in a joking way, but it's more just like a sibling ribbing way than like in a
something's wrong here.
Something's wrong.
Yeah.
And he keeps asking her for help with his friend's car. Yeah. Like he thinks she knows something, and he wants to get her help. And so I think that the siblings kind of contribute to that sense that like something's changing here. Of course, Doyle is young and is kind of the most progressive of anybody. But that's partly why he's funny.
And I think we talked a little bit about it actually before we came on, about, and I'm going to forget his name, the older man who's on the chain gang. John, good job. How many times have you seen this episode?
Many.
John, and he's kind of her only ally in this whole episode, but he's older. And so I wonder if maybe what you make of that, if there's maybe some sense of not all of us believe this, or, maybe some people believe that, believe in her, or just the possibility it doesn't have to be this way. Why do you think that? Because it could have been a younger person. I just think it's interesting that they have it be kind of this older working class man that kind of sees her.
I agree. I think it is an interesting choice. And he certainly doesn't, outright champion her.
Of course.
But he's also, not mocking her or treating her as if she doesn't belong there in a way that everybody else sort of does. But of course, Doyle is sort of nasty to him too, and dismissive to him. So there is an interesting sense of, I don't know if it's because he's a less powerful man, even though he's an older man, he doesn't have a lot of power in that setting because he's sort of the underling to
Yeah.
Doyle, if that might be part of it. It's hard to know exactly what to make of that, but he is he's a sympathetic character, and the fact that he's sympathetic and he's kind of respectful and nice to Betty is another way, I think, in which the audience is invited to sort of sympathize with Betty too.
Right. And give you just a little bit of an anchor, because she just suffers so much harassment in that whole episode. It's very unrelenting. So maybe we can move on to Mary Tyler Moore. So I just wonder if you can kind of give a sense, for those of us that saw it when it aired, and for those of us that didn't, just remind us kind of how important and influential, both from an industrial perspective and just kind of from a representational one, how important the show was.
Yeah, it's interesting. It's hard to know how clear this comes across, today, 50 years later. But Mary Tyler Moore was a really important show when it debuted in 1970. It was doing so many things differently than had been the case in television before that time. Largely having a single woman as the protagonist was almost unheard of. There had been a couple of examples of series before that point. And having, a quick anecdote, the creators of the show really wanted to make her divorced when the show began, and the network would not let them do it because they thought that people would think that Mary Tyler Moore had divorced Dick Van Dyke because she'd been his wife on the Dick Van Dyke Show. And so they're like, no, people will be so upset if they
You're going to talk about
divorced
society crumbling. Yeah, it's really going to crumble.
So they said, no, she can't be divorced. And so they're like, okay, we'll make her like coming off of a long relationship. And so, but even that, the acknowledgement that she had been in this, presumably intimate relationship with a man that she wasn't married to, and was, that was just quite unusual at the time. And so in addition to having this kind of innovation of the turn to the more workplace family, as opposed to the conventional family, just having the protagonist be this single working woman who, stays single through the whole series is the other amazing thing that I think, is very atypical now. We see lots of single women in television, but often they're heading towards some sort of long-term pairing. So having that be so central, and having things like the relationship between her and her women friends, Rhoda and Phyllis, be so central to the program was also, pretty unusual for the time. And so that's, those are among some of the things. It was also produced by an independent production company, which was also pretty unusual in television, where the Hollywood movie studios had been really dominant in TV production. And so some people credit that as one of the reasons it started to bring some of those new ideas to the screen.
And probably had, new forms of creative control and the ability to kind of influence some new possibilities that weren't kind of hitting that mainstream audience. So one of the things that we've already touched on with Betty, and that I think runs throughout this pilot, the Mary Tyler Moore episode, is just how, even though there's a lot of uncertainty, she feels unsure of herself, she's nervous, she's afraid, she's anxious about things, she calls herself a coward. I love that part with the blouse. She's also so certain about so much. She's so certain that she could have a relationship but doesn't want it on these terms. She takes a job she's probably not really qualified for, but feels like she's just going to go for it. She knows how she wants her apartment to be designed, despite how Bess does it. So can you talk a little bit about how that certainty, wrapped up with a little vulnerability, but really that kind of thread of certainty builds the character and kind of creates some of the tension in the show?
Yeah, it's really due to, both the writing and the performance. Those two kind of come together in this perfect way. And of course, it's called the Mary Tyler Moore Show. The show was designed around her. Yeah. She was already a big star. And she's so important to the role because of, her combination of sort of spunk and kind of vulnerability, right?
She's so good.
And she's so good at that. She walks that line so perfectly. Yeah. And, that's a testament to her talent, but also I think a testament to just certain qualities that she possesses. The quality of her voice and the way that she has the slight tremor to her voice is really significant. And some people have looked at that and said, okay, we want to look at this show as some sort of feminist kind of breakthrough. And in many ways it is, but she's also certainly not the most empowered character. She's often stumbles, she's often reluctant, but of course that's part of what makes her so likable and relatable too. And really one of the kind of innovations that this series and some others at the same time brought about was a real kind of multidimensionality to characters that you hadn't seen that much, especially in sitcoms before this point, and that all of the characters have these multiple dimensions, where like Lou is gruff, but he's also clearly really vulnerable. And, you know, they all have these kind of layers to them. And it's kind of remarkable in one, you know, in the one episode alone that you can see all of that coming out already.
Yeah.
It's just, you know, how beautifully the show was written. You can see that. But that the ways that she, her, you know, Mary herself as a character and as an actress are kind of bringing that kind of relatability was so important to being able to have a show that was doing something so different, that was having this, you know, single woman at the center of it. It was really important that that woman be a particular type that would have been palatable to a very wide audience, and you know, she was the ideal figure for that.
And it also allows you to kind of watch her navigate all these uncertainties and take all these hits. She has to have that certainty. You know, she has to really know what she wants, or else she wouldn't continue through it. And so, and in some ways, again, like the dress or the clothing, it externalizes those challenges that women come up against, because she's continually putting herself out there and throwing herself into the ring. And so you constantly see how that unfolds.
Yeah. What struck me watching this, I realized that she and Betty are not that far apart in time, right? This is like 14 years apart. That like Betty would have been 30 years old in 1970. Right. I was like having this little fantasy watching it again, like maybe that's Betty, who she grew up and then she moved to Minneapolis, and you know, like
I think that's in my question.
Oh, sorry.
Do you see this picking up where Betty left off?
Yeah, I mean it's almost like it's, you know, like it's the distance between those two moments is really vast, and it's only 14 years, and it's literally like the same, you know, character. I mean, it's not the same character, obviously, but like that age-wise, she would have been at that point by 1970. And I think that's just a demonstration of culturally how much had changed. Television didn't make that change happen alone, of course. There's lots of really important social and political developments that happen, but that, you know, the television evidences that so clearly in these two shows next to each other.
One thing that I also just can't get enough of in this episode is Bess and Phyllis, so Cloris Leachman, the fabulous Cloris Leachman, and her daughter. And there's also, so younger children, it seems like in sitcoms often provide a lot of comic relief. Right. So usually they're clueless about what's happening, or suddenly they're like very wise about what's happening, and they always kind of provide some ironic or, you know, very comedic role. And I think we saw Kathy, Betty's younger sister, you know, that's one mixed up kid. You know, we hear her kind of echo the sentiment of the time. But then Bess represents this definitely new kind of emergent young girl, where she is empowered to kind of be herself. She's going to understand the difference between what a real aunt and a, you know, a nominal aunt is. She's going to be able to rearrange the room. But you can also see Phyllis's real frustration with that, and the comedic tension is so wonderful. You know, that was mother's news, Bess. And she just has such a hard time kind of dealing with her entitlement that she's produced. Can you talk a little bit about, do you see in that kind of changing notions of mothers and daughters relating, of girlhood, of kind of trying to maybe raise empowered girls, and the tensions there? You know, I just think it's so nicely fraught, that relationship between those two.
It is, and you know, there's lots of, you know, fun stuff that happens in that relationship across that series. But yeah, I was struck by that too, about really, you know, I was thinking about the little girl in Modern Family too, when she answers the phone and gets mad when they say she sounds like a little girl. You know, so like that, those three girls are sort of interesting lined up together in that way. And yeah, I mean, Kathy is pretty sassy too in her Father Knows Best, you know, as much as would have been permitted in the world of Father Knows Best. And Bess is, you know, is bolder, and that's a sign of how much has changed in those 14 years. But definitely, I think there's a way in which children, I mean, part of the family sitcom formula is typically to have children as part of the narrative, and that the children can say and do things that, you know, maybe the adults wouldn't. And it's funny, and it's a point for children in the audience to connect to, but it also, you know, kind of reveals something about kind of the changing roles of children within families and within the society. And so you definitely see that. And Bess is a particularly like amusing character, because she's she's kind of a smart aleck type. And so that, you know, you get a sense of that in that pilot, I think.
Yeah, she's great. I love that episode. So turning to Modern Family, can you kind of see can you talk a little bit about how you see this fitting in this lineage? Because we kind of skipped over very important sitcom history, family sitcom history of the 80s and the 90s. So much happened there. I mean, we could only fit so much in. But can you kind of talk about how you see this, maybe jumping over a little bit, but how this fits in that lineage?
Sure. I mean, just thinking about time-wise, right, there's like a huge gap of time, as you're saying. Like the time between Father Knows Best and Mary Tyler Moore is quite small compared to what happens, from 70 to the Modern Family episode that we watched. And so that's, I think, important for us to keep in mind, although interestingly, like how similar some moments of it are, like the kind of boss who's kind of inappropriately, making comments about a younger woman's body and things like that, like as kind of Lou briefly does in Mary Tyler Moore, and then Charlie, I think is his name, Mitch's boss does with Haley. And so there's those, those moments that are, kind of disturbingly similar 40 plus years later. But I think it's an interesting example, one, because it kind of is in some ways a very familiar pattern of dealing with families. But of course, part of the conceit of Modern Family is that this is a Modern Family. This is a different kind of family. There's a same-sex couple. There's an older man with his younger second wife. And then there's the more conventional nuclear family of Claire and Phil's family. And so there's those, that's part of it, is like, the way we think about families is different now. Families are, we have a broader definition of families. All of those things are clearly part of what that show is trying to do. But I also thought this was an interesting episode to pair with the other two because of the role of work in it. Yes. And that's a theme that goes across all three. And in this case, here's, Claire, this woman who's been a stay-at-home parent for many years, trying to re-enter the workforce, not in a very, she's going to work for her father. It's not like the most bold step that she's taking, but she's clearly trying to kind of make it on her own, as Mary was, just at a different life stage and in a different context. Yeah. And still grappling with the older man who's like, not sure how to handle her being there and things like that. So there's some interesting parallels there. I also really like the story about Cam in this episode, and how he kind of finds a role for himself, because he's also been a stay-at-home parent, basically. And so, across the years of the show, when they adopt, Lily, thank you. When they adopt Lily, he primarily is her primary caregiver, and Cam is, and then he's sort of trying to find his career. And so I like how, the show is all about kind of diversifying the notion of family in certain ways, but I really like the way that it makes us think about gender in multiple ways too, and that like a man can also have this sort of effort to try and figure out who he is and find, and then of course what he finds is like, goes against our assumptions about identity, right? So he's a more effeminate gay man, and yet the ideal role for him is to be the football coach, which you don't think of as being that connection. So I like that, and I think that is like, if I'm not saying that we're looking at a straight line of progress here across these three shows by any means, but I think that's one thing that is a sign of some progress or change, at least from the earlier examples, and that we see a man having a similar kind of struggle to figure out how to fit together his career and his identity. And
then it can be more situated in those other life circumstances and decisions, rather than so fixed to gender and so fixed to kind of, this is how, Doyle, Hobbes's version of 1,000 years ago, people had it all figured out. So in this episode, we have gone from, from young Betty to Mary Tyler, Mary starting her career, entering into a career, and then Claire returning. So we get these kind of nice stages of work. But I think we don't really see women working. I mean, these episodes are really we don't see them really doing anything. Like Betty never gets to learn how to do the vermouth, whatever she calls it, scale. Mary's like sharpening pencils, and then Claire just spends so much of her time just trying to like manage the perception of herself and manage that she's just so awkward and trying to make other people kind of accept her. So what do you make of that?
Yeah, I mean, partly that's television, and that's the distorted mirror. Is like we don't see people on television doing at least in certain kinds of television, doing certain things that are very typical of the real world, like actually working at work, unless it's like a cop show or something where the cops are working. So, I mean, definitely in comedies, you don't see, even in the workplace comedy, you don't see a lot of work going on. And so that's, you know, again, like people spend their days working. Is that what they want to do when they're, you know, trying to relax and watch a comedy? So I think that's part of it, is just like television is not into the kind of mundane details of actual work.
Right.
And they're like, why would we want to talk about that?
Right.
But it is kind of interesting that in episodes that are primarily about work, there's not really work going on.
Or I guess what I was thinking is there could have been, you know, there could have been some breaks or some acts or some comedic kind of value in trying to learn it and struggling or figuring out that maybe this isn't what you want. It just seems that so much of it was about fighting to be in the space, fighting to be there and trying to, I don't know, that seemed to be what most of it was about, was just managing, and even Cam too, of just people's perception that he should or shouldn't be doing it.
Right.
Seems to be the preoccupation.
Right, and so maybe partly they're all stories about especially either women or feminized people being kind of having to kind of figure out or get them fight for a place for themselves in a space that's not typically associated with them, because they're typically more associated with the home and the domestic sphere. And so maybe that's part of it, is that there's just the very act of, you know, being outside the home, as you know, kind of dated as that sounds, that alone is kind of an important part of the journey of these that we're following these characters on. I mean, Mary in some ways has it's the least hard for her, because she doesn't even have a home at the start of the series.
Right. She's setting it all up at the same time.
Right.
Yeah, and I think still kind of having to wage that battle even in Modern Family, of that I belong to be here, or that I should be here, or you know, I think is interesting that persists. Yeah,
I mean, one of the ways Modern Family is a very conventional show in many respects is that, you know, there's this family, this you know, nuclear family is one of the families where the wife has been a stay-at-home parent for so many years, which is obviously not that common in contemporary American society.
Right. So two more quick thoughts that I have. So one, what I think I love about Modern Family is that, you know, they make fun of everybody. No one is safe from kind of being made fun of, and they set up gender dynamics that are really problematic. Like you said, Charlie is, you know, kind of very creepy to Haley. Jay is really dismissive of Claire. You know, there's all these, Phil calls it a 20-year vacation, Claire raising the children. So clearly they're like, you know, exaggerating this to talk about how awful it is. Right. But then also because they make fun of everybody, you know, Claire is also mocked, Haley's made fun of, Cam is also made fun of. I don't know how, do you think that it loses some of the critique, or it loses some of...
Yeah, I mean, I think the style of the comedy changes so much. Like, it's the pace is so much faster of the episode. Everything has this kind of, literally has this ironic distance because of the mockumentary framing on Modern Family. There's so many steps involved to kind of distance us from it in a way that's so different from the other examples, definitely different from Mary Tyler Moore, I think. So I think all of that, like, I'm not sure that we're really supposed to connect with the characters at the same emotional level. The jokes are fast, like there's more literal jokes, there's more like literal setup and punchline kind of jokes, even though there's no laugh track. And so all of those things, like it's a more kind of frenetic style of comedy, and it's a more, you know, like rapidly paced narrative, and there's there's more storylines, and it's just, it just is a different way of telling stories. And, you know, maybe it's kind of feels more contemporary and it's kind of faster paced, but I don't know, you know, maybe I'm just being nostalgic, but it seems like it's missing something that is, you know, about that deeper connection. And maybe you can get that, obviously there's so much television now, you can get that in other spaces, but in a kind of mainstream comedy like this, I think it's harder to get there.
Yeah, it just feels like it's a little bit harder to root for Claire like you root for Betty, or you root for Mary. You know, you're just so wanting them to succeed, but it's just a little bit harder, I think, because they're so caricature-y that it makes it hard. And so I feel like some of those, they're raising these really important issues, but then a little bit of it gets lost because it's harder to really root for them.
Yeah, agreed.
Okay, so one last quick question. So we start with, you know, everybody knows better than Betty, and in the end, she reveals everyone was right. She puts on the dress. And I feel like Mary really shows us that she knows best. You know, she knows better than Lou and Bill, and, you know, she's kind of the one that knows best. And then in the end of Modern Family, there's this moment where Jay gets to know best. You know, he gets to like, you know, I told you that you just needed to keep your head down and this is how you needed to work or whatever. Maybe I shouldn't be disheartened. I don't know. To me, it feels a little bit like a return to kind of that, you know, everybody knew better than Claire. But maybe I'm. Did you notice that thread?
Jay is also an object of ridicule.
Yes,
so
true.
like the way he's like shoving all the cookies in his mouth. Like so, I'm not sure. Like you were saying before, I think that there's no character. I mean, there's no authority figure really in Modern Family. Like they're all absurd in some way or another. And so I think that helps it. I think interestingly, even though Father Knows Best is called Father Knows Best, like I don't think the father has that much authority in that. I mean, he, you know, the way he drops the plate, like a kind of the bumbling father.
Yeah.
So even though people like to think about, oh, back then the fathers really were, you know, all-knowing and wise, he's, you know, he's still a little bit hapless. And it's, you know, it's more funnier that way. But yeah, and so I'm not sure that it's a full circle, but I do think that things haven't changed as much as you might think in, what is it, 65 years or so between, you know, the first example and the second we looked at.
Well, I want to thank everyone for coming out and to thank again Elana Levine for coming. Thank you all. It was wonderful.